Okay, James, I've been looking at the outline for this season, and I need to ask right away, is this whole Cadaver Synod thing actually real? Because it sounds like a heavy metal concept album.
It's 100% real, Sophie. In fact, if you pitched this to a Hollywood producer, they'd reject it for being too unrealistic and cartoonish. But in January of 897 AD, it really happened.
A dead pope, dressed in full robes, put on a trial in a cold church. I mean, who even thinks to do that?
Well, to understand how a society gets so broken that they put a decomposing corpse in court, we have to look at the world that made it possible. Welcome to the Saeculum Obscurum, the dark age of the Papacy.
Which, let's be honest, is an incredible name for a historical era, the Age of Darkness. But how did it start?
It starts with a hammer. Let me lay out the scene. We have to start in 882 AD, 15 years before our famous trial. Pope John VIII is sitting in the Lateran Palace, and he's incredibly stressed because Rome is surrounded by enemies. He is the first pope in Christian history to be assassinated, which is a massive historical milestone. But the way they did it, it wasn't a clean Shakespearean backstab in the shadows. The primary source for this is the Annals of Fulda, which is this contemporary German chronicle written with absolute grim efficiency. According to the chronicler, John's own inner circle, his relatives and trusted staff, decided he had to go.
So, they gave him poison. A classic, quiet Roman political solution. But the conspirators were incredibly bad at chemistry because the poison worked too slowly. So there they are, standing around the Pope in the private chambers, awkwardly waiting for him to die. Imagine the sheer panic in that room as they check their sundials and whisper to each other. They realise someone is going to walk in and catch them mid-murder. So they completely lose their patience, someone runs out to fetch a heavy iron blacksmith's hammer, and they simply beat his brains out right there on the marble floor. Now, this actually triggers a fascinating historical tangent. The Vatican has this long, terrifying reputation for poisons that stretches all the way to the Renaissance. Centuries later, the Borgias would perfect the use of cantarella, a sophisticated arsenic-based powder that was practically an art form. But long before poison became a high art science in Rome, 9th century Vatican staff had the raw, brutal clumsiness of amateur thugs. They couldn't wait for the chemicals to work, so they just resorted to blunt force. And this messy, chaotic assassination is the exact moment the spell was broken for the papacy.
The sheer administrative incompetence of it. It's like a Coen Brothers movie set in the medieval Vatican.
It really is. We've poisoned the Vicar of Christ, but he's just complaining of a slight headache. Quick, grab the hammer.
But you mentioned he was stressed because Rome was surrounded by enemies. Who was actually threatening them?
Well, this is where the story gets even more desperate. It wasn't just local rivals. They were facing an existential threat from the sea.
To understand why the clergy was so desperately paranoid, you have to look at what happened a few decades earlier, in 846 AD. Saracen raiders, basically Islamic pirates from North Africa, sailed right up the Tiber River. And they successfully sacked the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul outside the walls. The Liber Pontificalis, which is the official Vatican record of the lives of the popes, is absolutely devastated by this event. The chronicler laments that the raiders tore off the golden high altar of St. Peter's. They literally desecrated the tombs of the apostles, scattering the very bones of the Prince of the Apostles. This was the 9th century equivalent of 9/11 for Western Christendom. The ultimate spiritual sanctuary, completely violated and looted by foreign pirates. So John VIII, the guy who eventually got hammered, decided he had to become a military leader to stop it from happening again. According to Horace Mann, detailed histories of the early medieval popes, John VIII wasn't just praying for divine intervention. In 877 AD, he personally led a naval fleet against the Saracens off Cape Sarceo. He was literally standing on the deck of a war galley, commanding archers, and they actually captured 18 enemy ships. But heroism is expensive, and the papal treasury was completely empty. So, John VIII had to make an incredibly humiliating U-turn to save the city. He agreed to pay an annual tribute of 25,000 gold coins to those very same pirates. The successor of St. Peter became a tribute collector for the people who had scattered his predecessor's bones. He was melting down church gold, pathetically buying safety 1 year at a time. And his own Roman flock watched this with absolute disgust. They saw a pope who was shedding blood on warships and selling out the church treasury. That is the toxic environment where your own staff starts looking around for a hammer.
25,000 gold coins. That is an astronomical sum for the 9th century. They must have literally stripped the altars bare.
They did. It's the classic geopolitical mistake of paying protection money. It never actually works. It just shows you're weak.
But I still love the image of John VIII as this sort of Vatican Navy SEAL standing on a burning galley with a sword. It's so far removed from what we think of as a pope today.
It's badass, sure, but it completely destroyed the spiritual authority of the office. He looked like just another desperate local warlord.
Which is exactly what he was, because the city he was defending was barely even a city anymore.
This is the physical reality that is so difficult for us to wrap our heads around today. By the late 9th century, Rome was basically a post-apocalyptic ruin. At the height of the Roman Empire, the city housed over 1 million citizens. But by the time of our story, the population had collapsed to barely 15,000 people. Ferdinand Gregorovius, in his monumental History of the City of Rome in the Middle Ages, paints this incredibly haunting picture. He describes a tiny, terrified population living like squatters inside this colossal graveyard of ancient stone. The low-lying areas of the city, like the Roman Forum, would flood constantly when the Tiber River overflowed its banks. It turned the ancient heart of the empire into a thick, muddy swamp that smelled of sewage and malaria. At night, wolves literally hunted in the overgrown, bushy ruins of the Colosseum. And the actual people were crammed into these crowded, damp slums by the riverbend. It's the ultimate ruin pornography, like modern abandoned industrial hubs, but on an imperial scale. And because there was no central imperial power to protect them, the entire city went into survival mode. The holy grounds had to be heavily fortified. They built the Leonine Wall around St. Peter's, but they didn't use finely carved stones. They literally piled up broken fragments of ancient marble statues and pagan temple columns to make barriers. And because there was no army, the defence of these sacred walls was left to armed street gangs recruited from the local slums. This physical collapse directly bred a brutal, cynical, dog-eat-dog mindset among the Roman clergy. If you are a priest in 9th century Rome, you aren't debating theology or copying beautiful manuscripts. You are fighting for your life, aligning yourself with whatever local mob family controls your neighbourhood's water supply. The papacy wasn't a global spiritual office. It was a local municipal prize worth killing for.
That is so incredibly bleak. It's literally Mad Max, but with gold crosses and liturgical vestments.
It really is. You're trying to perform holy mass while worrying if the guy holding the incense is going to stab you for your boots.
And in this completely lawless wasteland, the rules they actually chose to get obsessed with are absolutely hilarious.
Oh, you mean the legal loophole they used to justify the whole trial? The spiritual bigamy?
Yes!
Because this is where the legal hypocrisy of the medieval church reaches absolute peak levels. Under 9th century canon law, there was this incredibly strict rule forbidding the translation of bishops. And translation didn't mean translating Latin texts, it meant moving a bishop from one diocese to another. The legal and theological theory was that when you were ordained, you were spiritually and legally married to your diocese.
So, if you were the bishop of a small, boring town like Porto, and you tried to become the bishop of a bigger, richer city like Rome, you were officially accused of clerical bigamy or spiritual adultery. Klaus Herbers, in his History of the Medieval Papacy, explains that this rule was originally designed to prevent ambitious priests from constantly career climbing. It was supposed to keep bishops humble and dedicated to their flock. But in the dog-eat-dog world of Rome, it became the ultimate political gotcha weapon. It was the 9th century equivalent of a massive corporate non-compete clause, or an archaic zoning law that your enemies suddenly dust off to ruin you. And this brings us directly to the star of our show, Cardinal Formosus. Now, first of all, his name literally translates from Latin as beautiful or good-looking, which is just the most brutal, horrific irony considering what is going to happen to his rotting corpse. But in life, he actually was a superstar. He was charismatic, brilliant, and highly competent. And he was the Bishop of Porto, a diocese right near the mouth of the Tiber. But because he was so good at diplomacy, successive popes kept sending him on these high-profile international missions. And every time he returned to Rome after a major success, his rivals would look at him with pure jealousy. They would whisper, "Look at Formosus, he's getting too popular. He's eyeing the chair of St. Peter."
But he's married to Porto. If he tries to become pope, he's a spiritual adulterer. It was this perfect legalistic trap. You cannot be promoted because you are legally bound to your first job forever.
Formosus the Beautiful. I still can't get over that. It's like naming a character in a horror movie Mr. Unsplatable, right before they get run over by a steamroller.
It really is. He's definitely not going to look very Formosus by the end of this season.
But his diplomatic success was genuinely legendary, especially when they sent him to Eastern Europe. This is where he became a household name.
Oh, the Bulgaria mission. This is where he gets his ultimate fanboy.
Yes, the Bulgaria story is one of my absolute favourite pieces of medieval geopolitical drama. So, in the 860s, King Boris I of Bulgaria decided his entire nation should convert to Christianity. But Boris was an incredibly sharp ruler. He didn't want to just bow down to Rome or Constantinople. Instead, he played the two biggest religious empires against each other like a nation shopping around for an Olympic bid. He was asking, who's going to offer me the best tax breaks? Who's going to let me run my own churches? And Rome decided to send Cardinal Formosus to win him over. When Formosus arrived in Bulgaria, he was an absolute sensation. He was tall, thin, deeply ascetic. He wore this cheap, rough wool cloak, refused to drink wine, and fasted constantly.
But he had this spellbinding, magnetic charisma that captivated the entire Bulgarian court. King Boris became so completely obsessed with him that he wouldn't listen to any other priest. The Carolingian letters preserve this incredible, frantic correspondence between Boris and the Vatican. Boris essentially issued an ultimatum to the Pope. We will stay loyal to the Roman Church, but only if you make Formosus the Archbishop of Bulgaria. If you don't give us Formosus, we are taking our entire country over to the Byzantines in Constantinople. This was a massive, terrifying geopolitical threat for Rome. But back in Rome, Pope Nicholas I and his successors were looking at the reports from Bulgaria with absolute horror. They thought, Formosus has just built a massive, loyal, private military and political power base in the east. If we make him Archbishop of Bulgaria, he will have his own empire.
He will be more powerful than the Pope himself. So they repeatedly refused King Boris's demands. And what excuse did they use? Our old friend, the translation rule. They wrote back, "Oh, we would love to, King Boris, but Formosus is already spiritually married to Porto. We couldn't possibly encourage spiritual bigamy." It was a blatant, cynical lie designed to keep a brilliant rival locked in a cage. But Boris didn't care about canon law, he just wanted his favourite priest. And this international tug-of-war is what ultimately painted a massive target on Formosus's back.
It's the ultimate corporate non-compete clause. We can't promote you because of company policy, but we also can't let you work for the Bulgarians because you're too good.
Exactly. They were terrified he'd take his talents to a competitor, so they kept him benched.
But this is where the political dread turns into actual, life-threatening paranoia. Because Pope John VIII, already unhinged by the constant threat of invasion, decides to purge his inner circle.
Oh, the excommunication of 876. This is where the conspiracy theories really start to fly.
In 876 AD, John VIII decided he was going to launch a massive, paranoid purge of everyone he suspected of disloyalty. And at the absolute top of his hit list was Formosus. According to the Annals of St. Bertin, the Pope officially excommunicated Formosus and a faction of prominent Roman nobles, and the charges they levelled against him were absolutely wild. They accused Formosus of conspiring to murder the Pope. They claimed he was plotting to turn Rome into a pagan stronghold. And the chronicler notes that John VIII literally declared that Formosus had corrupted the minds of the Bulgarians with his ambition. It is the 9th century equivalent of the McCarthy-era Red Scare trials. If you are a political rival, you aren't just a competitor anymore. You are an existential threat to the state. Formosus knew exactly what happened to people who crossed John VIII, and this was years before the hammer incident, when the Pope was still in his prime.
So he didn't stick around to defend himself. He fled Rome in the dead of night, disguised as a peasant, slipping through the ruined city gates. But John VIII wouldn't let it go. He tracked him down all the way to France, and he forced Formosus to sign an incredibly humiliating agreement called the Pact of Oath. Liutprand of Cremona, who wrote this incredibly dramatic history called Antipodesis, which literally translates as retribution, describes this scene in detail. Formosus was forced to swear on the holy relics of the saints. He had to promise that he would remain in permanent exile in France and never, ever return to Rome. And the ultimate humiliation? He had to agree to live the rest of his life as a simple layman, stripped of his priesthood. It was a complete execution of his character, designed to make him a non-person forever. But as we are going to see, an oath signed under the threat of execution, it doesn't hold up once the guy holding the hammer gets hammered himself.
That is such an incredible setup. The disgraced cardinal, stripped of his robes, exiled in France, swearing on relics he will never come back.
And yet, just 6 years later, John VIII gets his skull crushed.
Exactly. The hammer drops and suddenly everything changes.
So, the new pope immediately lifts the excommunication, right?
He does. They release him from his oath, they restore him as Bishop of Porto, and he comes back to Rome.
And then he actually wins the election. The exile becomes the pope.
In 891 AD, Formosus is crowned pope. The man they branded a pagan traitor is now holding the keys of heaven.
Which is where our real nightmare begins, because his enemies did not forget that exile.
Not at all. In the next episode, we are going to meet the terrifying House of Spoleto, the Iron Empress Agiltrude, and the fatal decision that led to the trial of the century.
I cannot wait. The wolves are hunting in the Colosseum, James, and they're getting closer to the Lateran.
They really are. See you next time on Past Tense.
Welcome back to Past Tense. So, Sophie, we left our friend Formosus in quite a spot at the end of our last chat.
Understatement of the century, James. He went from a literal non-person exiled in France to being crowned Pope in 891 AD. The Lateran was basically a gilded cage. If he wanted to survive, he had to navigate the family that held the real keys to the city, the House of Spoleto. Exactly, because to understand why he was in so much danger, we have to meet the family that actually owned Rome at this point, the House of Spoleto.
Ah, yes, and specifically the woman pulling all the strings. Let's talk about Agiltrude.
So, Empress Agiltrude, if you look at the traditional, older histories, she's often painted as this cartoon villain, this cackling, wicked queen of the Italian Dark Ages.
But Chris Wickham, in his brilliant book, Early Medieval Italy, reframes her completely. He argues she was actually the real political brain of the Spoletan dynasty, far more calculating, cold-blooded and competent than either her husband, Guy, or her teenage son, Lambert. She was a Lombard princess by birth, which is crucial because she carried this deep, generational, almost cellular hatred for the Carolingian Franks who had invaded Italy and conquered her ancestors' lands. And according to the Annales de Saint Bertin, she viewed the papacy not as some holy, untouchable spiritual lighthouse, but as a local municipal office. To her, the chair of St. Peter was a tool, a regional asset. If you wanted to crown your son as co-emperor of Italy, which she desperately did, you didn't ask the Pope nicely. You marched your army down the Tiber, took him by the throat, and made him do it. There's this amazing, telling description of her in the Annales Fuldensis, where she's described not as a queen, but as a virago, which today sounds like a modern insult, but in the 9th century it was a Latinized term of respect for a woman of masculine strength, political ruthlessness, and military focus. She watched Rome crumble around her and saw it not as a tragedy, but as a blank canvas for a new Italian empire under her family's absolute control.
And the only thing standing in her way was this gaunt, 80-year-old pope who smelled of cheap wool and ascetic fasting, who had already betrayed her faction once before. Formosus was a Frankish sympathiser at heart. He represented everything her family spent generations fighting against. So when Formosus took the papal throne, Agiltrude didn't just see a rival bishop. She saw a traitor to Italy sitting on her family's ultimate prize. She was the kind of person who didn't forget a slight. She was patient, she was incredibly well-funded, and she had an entire army of Lombard knights who answered only to her commands. You have to picture her sitting in her stronghold in Spoleto, wearing these incredibly heavy, glittering gold and scarlet Byzantine silks, surrounded by armed men, looking down the valley toward Rome. She knew the city was a ghost town. She knew the papacy had no army of its own. It was completely dependent on whoever could ride in with the most spears. And she made sure those spears belonged to her family. Her husband, Guy, had already forced the previous pope, Stephen V, to crown him emperor. But Guy died suddenly, leaving her young son Lambert on the throne. And that meant Agiltrude was running the entire show. She was the one holding the reins, and she was absolutely determined that no foreign, German-loving pope was going to take that crown away from her boy. The tension between her and Formosus wasn't just political. It was existential. It was a fight for who owned the future of Italy, and she was going to win it by any means necessary.
It's so chilling because Formosus must have known exactly who he was dealing with. He'd seen how they operated.
Oh, absolutely. He's 80 years old. He's survived John VIII's paranoid purges. He's survived exile. He knows she's a political predator.
And the stage he's playing on is just incredibly fragile. You mentioned the city being a ghost town, but the actual administrative state of the church at this point, it's a meat grinder.
A meat grinder? Is that a technical historical term?
Actually, yes. Claudio Rendina literally calls this 20-year period the papal meat grinder in his History of the Popes. And Rendina is not exaggerating. Between the assassination of John VIII in 882 and the turn of the century in 904 AD, we are looking at just over 2 decades. In those 22 years, there are 10 popes. 10! The average reign of a pope during this period is less than 2 years. And the survival rate is just horrific. At least 5 of them die of violent or highly suspicious causes. Poison, strangulation, starvation in a dark hole. It's the standard retirement package. And the physical reality of St. Peter's itself during this time is wild. It's not the grand, serene monument we see today. It was basically a fortress.
Because Rome had zero central authority, St. Peter's was fortified with these heavy, hasty walls built by piling up fragments of old pagan temples and marble statues. And who do you think was defending it? It wasn't holy knights or Swiss guards. Ferdinand Gregorovius, in his monumental History of the City of Rome in the Middle Ages, has this incredible grim description. He says the defence of the Holy Apostles was entrusted to armed street gangs recruited directly from the local Roman slums, the Rioni. So you have the Vicar of Christ praying at the altar, while outside the doors, literally feet away, you have these local mobsters with rusted swords and leather jerkins guarding the gates, throwing stones at rival gangs across the Tiber. It's a post-apocalyptic playground. The church treasury is so broke that John VIII had to pay a yearly tribute of 25,000 gold mancuses to Saracen pirates just to keep them from burning St. Peter's again. Horace K. Mann, in his Lives of the Popes, notes that this was the 9th century equivalent of a Danegeld, and the popes had to melt down the sacred gold vessels, the chalices, the plates from the altars to pay it off. In the Liber Pontificalis, the chronicler laments that the very gold of the temple was handed over to pagan invaders while the citizens watched in silent shame. So you have a bankrupt, fortified church guarded by mercenaries and street thugs being fought over by local warlords like Ageltrud.
Because Rome had zero central authority, St. Peter's was fortified with these heavy, hasty walls built by piling up fragments of old pagan temples and marble statues. And who do you think was defending it? It wasn't holy knights or Swiss guards. Ferdinand Gregorovius, in his monumental History of the City of Rome in the Middle Ages, has this incredible grim description. He says the defence of the Holy Apostles was entrusted to armed street gangs recruited directly from the local Roman slums, the Rioni. So you have the Vicar of Christ praying at the altar, while outside the doors, literally feet away, you have these local mobsters with rusted swords and leather jerkins guarding the gates, throwing stones at rival gangs across the Tiber. It's a post-apocalyptic playground. The church treasury is so broke that John VIII had to pay a yearly tribute of 25,000 gold mancuses to Saracen pirates just to keep them from burning St. Peter's again. Horace K. Mann, in his Lives of the Popes, notes that this was the 9th century equivalent of a Danegeld, and the popes had to melt down the sacred gold vessels, the chalices, the plates from the altars to pay it off. In the Liber Pontificalis, the chronicler laments that the very gold of the temple was handed over to pagan invaders while the citizens watched in silent shame. So you have a bankrupt, fortified church guarded by mercenaries and street thugs being fought over by local warlords like Ageltrud.
And every time a new pope is elected, the rival faction immediately starts plotting how to poison him or throw him into a dungeon. The sheer, grinding anxiety of waking up every day in the Lateran Palace, knowing your cupbearer has probably been bribed by the Spolitans, or that the gang guarding your door might change sides for a handful of silver. That is the daily reality of Formosus's papacy. It is not a spiritual retreat. It's a hostage situation.
A hostage situation? That is so bleak. It explains why he was so desperate.
And the reason the entire system fell apart so spectacularly is that the outer shield, The Carolingian Empire had completely dissolved.
Right, because 888 AD is the key date. Charles the Fat is deposed, and the empire of Charlemagne officially fractures into these warring petty kingdoms.
But the collapse wasn't just a failure of political will, it was driven by something happening in the very skies above Europe.
An environmental angle? Don't tell me we're doing climate change in the 9th century, James.
No, seriously, it's one of my favourite recent historical rabbit holes. Klaus Herbers writes in his Geschichte des Papsttum about how this era aligns with what scientists call the late antique Little Ice Age. We see this in the agricultural records from across Europe, a sudden dramatic drop in global temperatures. We are talking about decade-long winters, massive crop failures, and widespread famine.
And when the crops fail, the entire feudal system breaks down. Lords can't pay their knights, peasants are starving, and the central authority of the Carolingian state just evaporates because there's no tax base. It also, interestingly, is the primary driver behind the massive uptick in Viking raids and Saracen piracy during this exact period. If there's no food at home in Scandinavia or North Africa because of agricultural collapse, you get on a boat and you raid the places that still have gold. You raid the Mediterranean. So you have this global climate crisis triggering this chain reaction of starvation, barbarian raids, and political fragmentation. And Rosamund McKitterick, who has written extensively on the Frankish kingdoms, notes that when the empire dissolved under this pressure, the papacy went from being a global spiritual empire to a local municipal prize. So when the crops fail and the central Carolingian empire is dead, all that is left in Rome are these desperate local warlords fighting over the keys to the only warm room in town, the papal palace. There is no emperor in France or Germany who can march down to Rome to protect the Pope. The Frankish shield is gone. And that left Rome at the absolute mercy of the local Italian nobility, specifically the House of Spoleto under our Cersei Lannister Aegilshrewd. The Pope was no longer the spiritual leader of Western Christendom. He was the chaplain of a local mafia family. And if you didn't play ball with the family, they would replace you with someone who would. It's the ultimate loss of the sacred. The chair of St. Peter, which was supposed to represent the eternal kingdom of God, is reduced to a bloody, desperate survival game in a cold, starving city. And this is the world Formosus is trying to navigate. An 80-year-old ascetic who doesn't drink wine, who wears rough wool under his robes, suddenly finding himself as the primary target in this local turf war. And his election in 891, it wasn't the triumphant return we'd like to think it was.
Yeah, let's talk about that election, because it's so easy to paint him as this heroic returning exile. But the reality is much more cynical.
It really is. He was essentially a compromise candidate, wasn't he?
Compromise is a polite word for it. He was a political shield, a human shield.
How do you mean?
Well, think about who his enemies were. The Spoletans absolutely loathed him, but they also couldn't agree on a candidate of their own without sparking an immediate civil war in the streets of Rome. According to Richard P. McBrien's Lives of the Popes, Formosus was elected because he was the only candidate with enough international name recognition to satisfy the remaining Frankish loyalists, but old enough and compromised enough that the Spoletans thought they could control him. They looked at this 80-year-old man who had already been humiliated, who had signed that pact of oath promising never to return, and they thought, perfect, he's fragile, he's scared, and he won't last long. They essentially chose a sacrificial lamb. They needed someone with just enough residual status to pacify the crowds, but someone so exhausted and fragile that he wouldn't dare stand in their way. But this is the man who had single-handedly converted the Bulgarians, who had played King Boris and Pope Nicholas against each other like a master chess player. He wasn't going to be Aegiltrud's puppet. He still believed in the dignity of the office. He still believed that the Pope should be independent of these local thugs. But the tragic irony is that by taking the crown,
He placed himself directly in the crosshairs of the most dangerous family in Italy. Because immediately after his election, Adultrude and her husband Guy march into Rome with their Lombard knights. They surround the Lateran, and they force Formosus to crown Guy's young son Lambert as co-emperor. And you have to imagine the scene in St. Peter's. Formosus, this towering, gaunt figure, looking down at this teenage boy, Lambert, knowing that the boy's mother, Adultrude, is standing right there in her glittering silks, watching his every move.
He is being forced to bless the very dynasty that destroyed his career and drove him into exile. Ernst Dummler's study of the period highlights that this was a psychological submission. He had to stand there and repeat these sacred formulas of coronation, knowing they were a complete sham, while the chainmail of the Spoletan knights clinked in the cold draughts of the basilica. It was Adultrude saying, "We own you. We own the keys to heaven, and you will stamp our passports whenever we tell you to." And for a few years, Formosus played along. He smiled, he blessed them, he signed their decrees. He bided his time. But underneath those ascetic woolen robes, the old diplomat was plotting his final, most desperate move. And it was a move that would ultimately cost him his grave.
This is where the story gets so incredibly tense, because Formosus realizes he is slowly being suffocated in the Lateran.
He's trapped. He has no army, his treasury is empty, and his protectors are the very people he needs protection from.
It's the classic mafia protection racket. Nice church you got here, Pope. Shame if something happened to it.
So, what does he do? He does the one thing he swore on the relics of the saints he would never do.
He reaches out to the north. He calls in the Germans. And this is the moment where Formosus turns from a tragic hostage into a highly controversial political player. He decides to play the ultimate wild card.
He secretly sends a delegation across the Alps to Arnulf of Carinthia, the king of the East Franks, the Germans. We find in the Carolingian letters, specifically the correspondence of Nicholas I and subsequent papal archives, how dangerous this kind of correspondence was. And the Annales Fuldenses, in their entry for 895 AD, preserve this incredibly dramatic, almost desperate appeal. The Pope's secret envoys reached Arnulf and delivered this message: "Come and deliver me from the hands of the wicked. Come to Rome, free the Church of St. Peter, and we will crown you Holy Roman Emperor." Now, this is an absolute betrayal of his treaty with the Spoletans. He is actively inviting a foreign invading army into Italy to overthrow the very emperor, young Lambert, whom he had personally crowned. Was this an act of spiritual desperation? Or was it a cold-blooded, cynical political move? It's a massive debate among historians. Because he knew what would happen if a Germanic army marched south. They wouldn't just bring peace, they would pillage, they would burn, they would sack Italian towns along the way. He was basically inviting a wolf into his house to kill the rabid dog in the living room. But Arnulf of Carinthia, he doesn't need to be asked twice. This is his chance to claim the imperial title, the ultimate legacy of Charlemagne. So in late 895, Arnulf mobilizes this massive Germanic host, knights, siege engines, thousands of troops marching through the Alpine passes.
And Adultrude hears about this. She is absolutely furious. She realizes that the old man in the Lateran has gone behind her back and signed her dynasty's death warrant. She immediately locks down Rome. She fortifies the walls, she mobilizes her Lombard garrison, and she takes Formosus hostage, locking him in the Castel Sant'Angelo. So as Arnulf's army approaches the northern gates of Rome, the Pope is sitting in a dark, cold stone room in the papal fortress, listening to the sound of his own citizens screaming on the battlements. The tension must have been absolutely suffocating. The city is surrounded, the Pope is a prisoner, and the Germanic conqueror is at the gates, demanding entry. It is a cinematic standoff of the highest order. And the climax,
It is one of those moments where history takes a turn so sudden and bizarre that if you wrote it in a screenplay, nobody would believe you.
I love this part, because Arnulf doesn't just besiege the city, he actually takes it because of a weird accident, right?
Yes! There's this story that a hare, a rabbit, ran toward the walls, and the German soldiers started chasing it, shouting and screaming.
And the Roman defenders on the walls thought it was a full-scale assault, panicked and abandoned their posts.
It is the most chaotic medieval siege ever. The Germans literally chase a rabbit into the Eternal City, take the walls and free the Pope.
So Formosus is saved. He's freed, he's back on his throne, and in February 896, he crowns Arnulf as Holy Roman Emperor.
He does. The triumph of Formosus. He's defeated Ageltrude, he's got his German protector, and he's at the absolute height of his power.
And then the cosmic bad luck kicks in.
It is the ultimate tragic twist. Literally days after the coronation, as Arnulf is preparing his army to march south to Spoleto and crush Ageltrude's stronghold once and for all, he collapses.
Arnulf suffers a sudden, massive, paralysing stroke. He is completely incapacitated, unable to speak, unable to lead, barely able to move.
And Liutprand of Cremona, writing in his Antipodesis, which literally translates to retribution, captures the stunned awe of contemporaries. He writes that just as the Germanic conqueror held the crown of the world, the hand of God struck him down, leaving the Pope to face the wolves alone. The German army, suddenly leaderless and terrified that this stroke was a literal divine curse for desecrating Rome, panics. They pack up their siege engines, they turn their horses around, and they retreat back across the Alps to Germany, carrying their half-paralysed king in a litter. And Formosus is left standing on the steps of St. Peter's, watching the dust rise from the retreating Germanic cavalry, realising that his shield has just dissolved into thin air.
He is 80 years old. He has betrayed the most ruthless woman in Italy. He has brought an invading army to sack her lands. And now his protector is gone. And Ageltrude is still out there. She's in her fortress in Spoleto. She's untouched, and she has an army of furious Lombard knights who are ready for blood.
The sheer terror
Of those weeks in the spring of 896, Formosus is trapped in the Lateran Palace, listening to the drafts whistling through the cold marble corridors, knowing that every step he hears on the stone floor could be his assassin. He has no money left. The treasury is completely bare after paying for the coronation festivities. And the local street gangs have already started slipping away, realising the Spoletans are coming back. And then, in April 896, just weeks after Arnulf's stroke, Formosus dies. Now, the official record says he died of natural causes, which for an 80-year-old man who's just lived through 2 sieges, a hostage situation, and a political collapse is entirely believable. But there were persistent, dark whispers in Rome that he was poisoned by Spoletan agents who had managed to slip back into the city. Caesar Baronius, in his Annales Ecclesiastici, later wrote of this moment as the turning point where the Mobsters truly took over, because his death didn't satisfy them. They didn't just want him dead. They wanted his memory destroyed. They wanted to chase him into the very grave. And that is how we end up with a corpse on a throne.
It's like a classic noir movie where the villain is so incredibly pissed off that the hero died of natural causes that they decide to desecrate his legacy anyway.
Exactly. You don't get to escape us by dying, Formosus. It's this pathological, obsessive need for vengeance.
And this is where Ageltrude's vengeance takes a turn into pure macabre theatre.
She wanted a public submission, even if she had to drag him from the next world to get it.
Exactly. She was going to show the entire city that the House of Spoleto's authority didn't end at the grave.
And that trial is what we are going to dive into next time, the Cadaver Synod itself.
Get your shovels ready, James. We are going to dig him up.
I've got mine. See you next time on Past Tense.
OK, James, we've got our shovels ready. But before we actually dig up our beautiful corpse, we have to talk about the absolute chaos left behind in April 896.
It was a total nightmare scenario. The chair of St. Peter is empty, the Spolitan army is marching on the city, and the Romans are panicking.
Right, because their Germanic saviour Arnulf had just had that sudden stroke, leaving them completely undefended. It's like inviting a wolf into the house to kill a rabid dog, and then the wolf just falls asleep on the rug. Exactly. The Germanic troops had retreated back over the Alps, and now the rabid dogs, the Spolitans, are back with a vengeance.
April 896. Pope Formosus is dead, and the first thing that falls over Rome is this heavy, terrifying silence. The city is waiting for the other shoe to drop. Horace K. Mann, in his exhaustive history of the early medieval popes, suggests that the panic in the streets was almost physical. Because remember, Empress Adgeltrude and her teenage son Lambert are marching back down from Spoleto, and they are not coming to negotiate. They are coming to reclaim their prize, and they are absolutely furious about the betrayal that had forced them to flee their own capital. The chronicler Flodoard of Rheims writes that the Roman clergy were essentially locking themselves in their cold stone cells, praying for a quick end. They knew the Spoletans didn't just want to install a new puppet pope, they wanted to erase the very legacy of the man who had invited the Germans to invade. But Formosus had pulled the ultimate, frustrating trick on his enemies. He had died before they could touch him. Now, he was 80 years old, so a natural death is entirely plausible, but the timing was so perfect that contemporary writers like Auxilius of Naples openly accused the Spoletans of poisoning his wine. And this is where we see the raw, brutal clumsiness of 9th century politics. Long before the Renaissance Borgias turned poisoning into an art form with their famous Cantarella arsenic powder, people in this era were much more direct.
April 896. Pope Formosus is dead, and the first thing that falls over Rome is this heavy, terrifying silence. The city is waiting for the other shoe to drop. Horace K. Mann, in his exhaustive history of the early medieval popes, suggests that the panic in the streets was almost physical. Because remember, Empress Adgeltrude and her teenage son Lambert are marching back down from Spoleto, and they are not coming to negotiate. They are coming to reclaim their prize, and they are absolutely furious about the betrayal that had forced them to flee their own capital. The chronicler Flodoard of Rheims writes that the Roman clergy were essentially locking themselves in their cold stone cells, praying for a quick end. They knew the Spoletans didn't just want to install a new puppet pope. They wanted to erase the very legacy of the man who had invited the Germans to invade. But Formosus had pulled the ultimate, frustrating trick on his enemies. He had died before they could touch him. Now, he was 80 years old, so a natural death is entirely plausible. But the timing was so perfect that contemporary writers like Auxilius of Naples openly accused the Spoletans of poisoning his wine. And this is where we see the raw, brutal clumsiness of 9th century politics. Long before the Renaissance Borgias turned poisoning into an art form with their famous Cantarella arsenic powder, people in this era were much more direct.
If the poison failed, they didn't hesitate to use brute physical violence right there on the palace floor to ensure the job was finished. So whether it was poison or just the sheer crushing weight of knowing the Spolitan army was at the gates, Formosus was gone, escaping to the grave. And Adgeltrude is left standing outside the city walls, robbed of her physical vengeance. Her son's imperial crown had been declared invalid by the deceased pope. The man responsible was lying in a stone sarcophagus inside St. Peter's, completely beyond her reach. Or so she thought.
Because if you can't punish the living, the legal and theological landscape of the late 9th century offered some truly dark, obsessive alternatives. But before she can execute her grand plan of post-mortem revenge, Rome experiences a brief, chaotic 15-day speed bump. A moment of pure, unadulterated street politics that shows just how broken the entire system had become.
Oh, yes, the 15-day interlude of Boniface VI, the ultimate gig economy papacy.
He barely had time to sit on the throne, let alone unpack his vestments.
But the background on this guy is just unbelievable. I mean, how does he even get on the ballot?
Well, you have to look at the state of the Roman street factions at that exact second.
To understand how Boniface VI gets the job, you have to realise that Rome was in a state of absolute lawless panic.
The Spalatans are close, but they haven't actually crossed the Tiber yet. And the local Roman mob, these armed neighbourhood gangs recruited from the slums to guard the basilicas, they decide they want their own guy on the throne. And their choice is a man who had already been defrocked twice for gross immorality. According to Richard P. McBrien's Lives of the Popes, Boniface had been stripped of his priesthood once for neglect of duty, and a second time for behaviour so scandalous the chroniclers won't even write it down. He was a priest who basically refused to do any priest stuff and spent his time running around the Roman underworld. He's the 9th century equivalent of a disbarred lawyer being appointed chief justice by a rioting crowd. But the mob doesn't care about canon law or moral purity. They drag this twice-disgraced priest to the Lateran Palace, throw him on the throne, and force the remaining clergy to ordain him. It's a complete grassroots hostile takeover of the Holy See. Boniface sits on the chair of St. Peter, probably pats his pockets, and decides to open the papal treasury drawer. And what does he find? Absolutely nothing. Remember when we talked about John VIII melting down the actual golden altars of the churches to pay that humiliating annual tribute of 25,000 gold coins to the Saracen pirates? And then Formosa spending whatever was left to buy the loyalty of the German troops during the rabbit-induced siege? The papal treasury was bone dry. There are nothing but unpaid bills, letters of excommunication, and the distant sound of Lombard swords being sharpened. It reminds me of that classic geopolitical move where a country shoops around for the best deal, like King Boris of Bulgaria playing Rome and Constantinople against each other like an Olympic host bidding war. He was holding a knife to the Vatican's spiritual throat, threatening to defect to Constantinople if they didn't send his favourite diplomat. But Boniface VI had no such leverage. He had no charisma, no army, and an empty treasury. He took one look at the incoming Spolitan forces and realised his time was up. 15 days into his pontificate, Boniface VI dies of gout. Now, gout in the late 9th century is the ultimate political euphemism. It is the historical equivalent of a modern politician stepping down to spend more time with his family right before the indictment drops. He took one look at the incoming train wreck, realised he was about to be murdered, and decided that dying of gout was the safest career option available.
I love the idea that gout was his exit strategy. I'm sorry, my big toe hurts. I must immediately cease being the vicar of Christ.
It really is a speed run of the papacy. But his gout leaves the door wide open for Stephen VI. And this is where things go from corrupt to genuinely, deeply unhinged.
This is the moment where the shovels actually hit the dirt, because Stephen VI is a complete puppet of Empress Ageltrude.
And the Spoletan army is now inside the gates. They own the city. Go on, James. Give us the setup.
Stephen VI is elected in the summer of 896, and he is a man under intense, suffocating pressure. Empress Ageltrude and her son Lambert are back in Rome, and their fury has only fermented over the winter. They demand a public, spectacular trial of the deceased Formosus. And so, in the damp,
freezing cold of January 897, the order is given. Stephen VI commands the grave diggers of St. Peter's to go down into the crypts. They pry open the heavy marble sarcophagus where Formosus had been resting for 9 long months. The German historian Ferdinand Gregorovius, in his monumental History of the City of Rome, describes this as the moment the city lost its last shred of civilized decency. Because they don't just inspect the grave to prove he's dead, they physically hoist the decomposing body out of the tomb. Think about the physical reality here. Formosus had not been embalmed. He was an 80-year-old ascetic who spent his life fasting. He had been rotting in a damp crypt next to the muddy Tiber. His skin is grey and falling away, his eyes are gone, and yet they dress him in the full, glittering pontifical robes of scarlet and gold Byzantine silk. They place the white wall pallium, the sacred symbol of metropolitan authority, around his neck.
They jam the gold and jewelled triple tiara onto his collapsing, hairless skull, and they carry this melting, heavy corpse across Rome to the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the actual seat of the Pope. They sit him down on a gilded wooden throne in the centre of the sanctuary. The bishops of the Roman clergy are forced to sit in the choir stalls, acting as the jury. And there he sits, propped up on a gilded throne, his skull wired shut so the jaw doesn't fall off during the trial, while the cold winter wind whistles through the cracks of the basilica.
Oh, God. The visual of that is just... It's not even a trial at that point. It's a desecration of the eyes.
It was designed to be as visually shocking as possible, a deliberate physical demonstration of how low they could drag him.
But what kills me about this whole scene is the legal theatre. They didn't just put him there to look at him, they actually appointed a defence attorney for him?
Oh, the poor deacon. I cannot even begin to imagine the sheer, unmitigated terror of being that guy.
Think about being that young deacon. You are probably 19 or 20 years old. You have spent years studying Latin grammar and liturgy, hoping for a nice, quiet, bureaucratic job copying manuscripts in the Lateran archives. And suddenly, Pope Stephen VI, who is visibly trembling with rage, points his finger at you and says, You are representing the corpse. And you have to stand right next to it for 3 days.
The contemporary writer Vulgarius notes that the stench inside the basilica was so thick and putrid that several of the cardinals had to keep leaving the hall to throw up in the courtyard. But you, the deacon, cannot leave. You have to stand there, clutching your wet parchment scrolls, smelling the rotting flesh of your former spiritual father. Every time Stephen VI screams a legal accusation at the corpse, "Why did you violate the canons? Why did you perform these illegal ordinations?" you have to step forward. And you have to answer on his behalf, in the first person. This is highly reminiscent of other famous posthumous trials, like when Charles II dug up Oliver Cromwell in 1661 to hang him at Tyburn. But this is actually worse, because Cromwell was just a skeleton in a shroud. With Cromwell, it was a symbolic execution of a skeleton. Here, they are conducting an interactive, back-and-forth courtroom drama with a body that is actively melting onto the carpet. And the deacon knows that if he defends Formosus too well, the Spalaton knights standing in the aisles with their hands on their hilt guards will murder him after the trial. But if he doesn't speak at all, he'll be defrocked or executed for contempt of court. It is the ultimate lose-lose show trial. It parallels the Stalinist purges or the McCarthy hearings, where the script is already written, and your only job is to play the pathetic, trembling loser who confesses to everything. The source material says the deacon's voice was so quiet and shaking that the scribes had to move their desks closer to the throne just to hear him whisper his confessions. Imagine standing next to a decaying pope, trying to speak for him, while knowing you're essentially signing your own career's death warrant.
It is absolute, unadulterated psychological torture. The poor kid was probably having a complete nervous breakdown right there on the altar.
I would have passed out on day one. But what gets me is the actual legal defence. What were they actually charging him with?
This is where the canonical law of the 9th century goes completely through the looking glass, and it involves a massive legal paradox.
Oh, tell me, because the spiritual adultery thing already sounded like a terrible excuse for a political purge.
So Stephen VI stands up in front of the assembly, pointing his finger directly at Formosus's grey, decaying face. He accuses him of violating the canons of the Council of Nicaea regarding the translation of bishops. Specifically, that Formosus was already the Bishop of Porto when he was elected Pope of Rome. Now, as we discussed earlier, under 9th century canon law, a bishop is considered legally and spiritually married to his diocese. Moving to another diocese was viewed as spiritual adultery.
As Rosamund McKitterick notes in her work on the Carolingian kingdoms, this rule was originally a genuine theological safeguard to stop ambitious priests from constantly trading up to richer cities. It was a spiritual binding, a theological contract that supposedly sealed your soul to a specific piece of land until death. But Stephen VI is using it as a purely political gotcha. He argues that because Formosus's election as pope was invalid due to this adultery, every single act he performed as pope was completely null and void. Every priest Formosus ordained? Not really a priest. Every bishop he consecrated? Not really a bishop. And this is where the Spalatin's plan hits a spectacular, mind-bending wall of cognitive dissonance. In his brilliant study, Auxilius und Vulgarius, the German historian Ernst Dummler points out the fatal flaw in Stephen's logic. Who consecrated Stephen VI as a bishop in the first place? It was Formosus. Formosus had personally laid his hands on Stephen's head and made him the Bishop of Anagni. So, if Formosus was an invalid pope, and all of his consecrations were null and void, then Stephen VI was never legally a bishop. And if Stephen was never legally a bishop, he could not, under canon law, be elected Pope of Rome. By proving Formosus was a fraud, Stephen is literally declaring his own papacy illegal. He is sawing off the very branch he is sitting on, using a giant gold-plated liturgical saw, all to please the Spalatin family who had put him there.
Talk about a legal suicide mission. He's literally arguing that his own ordination was a crime, which makes his own crown completely worthless.
They were so blinded by the need to destroy Formosus that they didn't even notice they were dismantling their own throne in public.
But the Spalatins didn't care about the paradox because they had the swords. But nature, or God, depending on who you asked, had some very dramatic thoughts on the matter.
Oh, the earthquake. The ultimate divine mic drop.
Right in the middle of this 3-day screaming match, the earth literally begins to shake under their feet. The Basilica of St. John Lateran, this massive ancient stone complex, begins to groan and buckle. Dust and chunks of heavy Roman mortar start raining down from the vault, coating the cardinals, the soldiers, and the melting corpse on the throne in grey plaster. Part of the roof actually collapses with a deafening crash right in the portico. Now, you would think, in the deeply superstitious 9th century, a literal earthquake hitting the church during a corpse trial would be a pretty clear sign from God. Like, hey guys, maybe don't do this. I'm literally shaking the building.
But Stephen VI and Empress Ageltrude are too far gone in their madness. They ignore the falling masonry, quickly read out the guilty verdict, and begin the execution of the sentence. They strip the sacred papal vestments off the body, tearing the fine silks from the decaying skin. They chop off the 3 fingers of his right hand, the 3 fingers Formosus had used to give the apostolic blessing to millions of Christians. They drag his mutilated, naked body out of the basilica, through the muddy winter streets of Rome, and dump him into a common pauper's grave. And then, a few days later, they decide the grave is too good for him. They dig him up again, tie heavy stones to his feet, and throw him into the Tiber River. But this is where the Spoletan mafia protection racket completely backfires. The Roman people, who had tolerated a lot of weirdness during this dark age, look at this and something snaps. As Chris Wickham points out in his study of early medieval Italy, the physical desecration of a pope's body was a bridge too far for the local populace. They saw the mutilated body of a pope floating in their drinking water, and a massive, furious riot erupts across the city. Just months after the trial, an angry mob storms the Lateran Palace. They overwhelm the guards, grab Stephen VI, and drag him down to the dungeons. They strip him of his robes, throw him into a pitch-black stone cell, and strangle him to death.
Remember when we started this journey with Pope John VIII being beaten to death with a hammer by his own staff? The Spoletan retirement plan for Stephen VI was even worse. A slow, terrifying suffocation in the dark, entirely abandoned by the royal family he had destroyed his own soul to please.
It is a brutal, terrifying symmetry. The papal meat grinder claims another victim, and the blood just keeps flowing.
It really is a meat grinder. But the story of Formosus doesn't end in the mud of the Tiber, does it?
No, because the river actually gives him back. And that brings us to the ultimate haunting meaning of this entire era. There is this beautiful, almost mythical postscript to the whole horror show. A local fisherman is casting his nets in the Tiber near Porto, and he pulls up something heavy and waterlogged. It is the body of Formosus, still recognisable by the scraps of cloth clinging to his bones. The fisherman, along with some local monks who were still loyal to his memory, secretly bury him in a safe place along the banks. And soon whispered rumours start spreading through Rome of miracles happening where his body was found. Images of the saints bowing to his coffin as it floated past the city walls. A year later, a new pope, Theodore II, who only reigns for 20 days before the meat grinder claims him too, officially rehabilitates Formosus.
He has the body exhumed once more, dressed in fresh, clean papal robes, and reburied with full honours in the tombs of the popes at St. Peter's. Liutprand of Cremona, in his work Antipodosis, writes that as they carried his coffin back into the basilica, the images of the saints in the portico seemed to whisper, Amen. But the damage to the sacred institution was done. The veil had been torn. For the next century, the papacy is a revolving door of violence, a period the 16th century Vatican historian Caesar Baronius called the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Age. And Baronius has this absolutely devastating line in his Annales Ecclesiastici that I think defines this entire nightmare. He wrote, Christ was asleep in the boat, and while he slept, monsters ruled the waves. It is this profound, terrifying image of cosmic abandonment. The idea that the highest spiritual authority on earth could lose its mind so completely that even its own historians had to conclude that God had simply turned his back for a century.
Because how else do you explain it? How do you explain a system of faith and law devolving into a gang war over a rotting corpse? It shows us that no institution, no matter how sacred, no matter how ancient, is immune to the rot of political desperation. When the rules become nothing but weapons to destroy your enemies, the temple becomes a slaughterhouse.
Oh, that is incredibly heavy, James, but so true. Once you weaponize the law to that extent, you destroy the very reason why anyone should believe in you in the first place.
Exactly. The Cadaver Synod isn't just a weird piece of historical trivia. It's a warning about what happens when we let political tribalism consume our core institutions.
A warning to keep the shovels in the shed.
Yes, definitely. Leave the dead in the ground.
Well, that is all we have for our first dive into the Saeculum Obscurum. Next time, we are going to look at the pornocracy, the era where Rome was run by a family of brilliant, ruthless women who made Empress Adultrude look like a rank amateur.
Oh, I cannot wait. Thank you for listening to Past Tense.
See you next time.